The news clips always sound the same. A polished anchor's voice, a familiar face on the screen, and then a cold line that cuts through everything else. She was found dead this morning in Midtown Manhattan. Another report follows, this time about the creator of a legendary music show, ending with the words self-inflicted gunshot wound. These are people the world once watched with admiration, crowned on beauty stages, leading landmark TV programs, standing under roaring applause. We call them icons of success, symbols of what it means to make it. Yet away from the cameras, their lives were often anything but glamorous. Fame never guaranteed peace. Success was no armor against scars, whether on the body or buried in the mind. The stories we're about to open aren't about their glory, their awards, or the glossy images that loop on television. They're about the private corners of 15 lives, where the person doing the most damage was not an enemy, not the industry, but themselves. Step by step, over months and years, they moved through routines that looked from the outside like slow-motion self-torture. J.J. Johnson, the jazz trombone genius, who slowly pushed himself into a pit of isolation and despair. J.J. Johnson's name once commanded instant respect in every jazz club that mattered. His trombone tone was sharp, clean, and impossibly precise, helping define the sound of bebop and setting a new standard for what his instrument could do. His career stretched across decades. He recorded classic albums, played alongside giants, and became a reference point for entire generations of musicians. On stage, he was the picture of control. A quiet leader who could shift the mood of an entire band with just a few notes, never raising his voice, never seeming rattled. To audiences, J.J. Johnson looked like a man who had his life firmly in hand, steady, disciplined, and unbreakable. But as the 1980s neared their end, and he entered his 60s, that bright arc began to bend downward. Retirement from major touring and high-profile performances left him with something he hadn't prepared for: empty time. The big stages faded. Invitations slowed. The silence that followed didn't feel like rest, it felt like something had been ripped away. By the early 1990s, he was appearing less and less in public. Friends and colleagues noticed him withdrawing from the musical world he had once helped lead. The man who had filled rooms with sound started choosing closed doors and unanswered calls. Then in 1995 came a diagnosis that landed like a direct blow: prostate cancer. The thought of a long, drawn-out illness, an invisible enemy eating away at him, day after day, terrified him. According to people who knew him, that fear settled into his bones and never really left. From that point on, alcohol moved from the sidelines to the center of his daily routine. Every night, glass after glass, he drank until the edges of his thoughts went soft, and the panic quieted for a few hours. Cigarettes, which had long been part of his life, became constant companions. Smoke curled through his small rooms at all hours, clinging to curtains, furniture, and clothes. Coughs grew harsher. His body weakened, yet the routine didn't change. There were stretches when he reportedly locked himself inside his old recording studio for weeks. The outside world shrank to a dim control room, lamp-dusty equipment, and walls that remembered better days. Meals were irregular, sometimes only a sandwich or a handful of crackers every couple of days. Time blurred days, bleeding into nights, into more of the same. The only consistent sounds were ragged breathing, the faint hum of machines, and the clink of glasses. J.J. Johnson had survived heroin dependency in his youth, fighting his way back to the top with discipline and focus. But this time was different. This wasn't a sudden addiction crashing into a healthy life. It was a deliberate, slow motion, unraveling a chain of choices that chipped away at his health, his relationships, and his will to keep going. Depression deepened, wrapping itself around his isolation. Phone calls went unanswered. Social visits became rare. The man who had once stood in front of orchestras now spent evenings alone, nursing pain that had no stage and no audience. As the late 1990s rolled in his body, started to revolt in ways that could no longer be ignored. Respiratory problems flared. He was rushed to hospital, stabilized, then sent back home. Each discharge meant returning to the same small spaces, the same bottles, the same thoughts. Every time he came back through his own door, his body a little weaker, his spirit a little more drained. Hope for recovery, for a future that looked anything like his past, faded. By 2001, the inner pressure had become unbearable. After years of pushing his body with alcohol, cigarettes, sleepless nights, and chosen isolation, J. Johnson reached what he saw as the end of the road. He used a gun to end his life. A pioneering jazz mind, a man whose horn had once defined an era, left behind not only a vast musical legacy, but also a chilling record of how a person can collapse in slow motion, step by step, alone, unnoticed after the curtain has already fallen. Dave Duerson, the NFL enforcer, dragged into a nightmare of brain trauma and self-destruction. Dave Duerson was once everything a professional football team wanted, in a defender disciplined, intelligent, and relentless. He won titles, anchored championship defenses, and earned a reputation as a quiet, dependable leader. After walking away from the field in 1993, he seemed to write the perfect second chapter, moving into business with the same toughness he'd shown on the turf. To the public, Dave Duerson looked like proof that an NFL star could transition into normal life and stay on top. But behind that image, something was shifting. By the mid-2000s, the cracks began to show. The headaches came first, thick, pounding pain that didn't match his age or apparent health. Then came explosive mood swings and emotional shifts that blindsided the people around him. Decades of helmet-to-helmet collisions had left a trail of invisible damage in his brain, and now it was coming due. As he moved through his 40s and into his 50s, the man who once prided himself on control started losing it. Business ventures faltered one after another. Projects he'd put his name and money into collapsed. Financial pressure mounted, dragging his confidence down with it. Then came the divorce in 2009, tearing apart what remained of his stability at home. Arguments escalated into full-blown outbursts. In fits of rage, he reportedly smashed objects with his bare hands until they bled, leaving behind destroyed rooms and a haunted silence that said more than any words could. These weren't just flashes of temper. They were signs of a mind losing its anchor. There were phases when Dave Duerson deliberately pushed himself into dangerous situations, driving at high speeds while his head pounded, sometimes at night, without headlights, as if flirting with the edge just to feel he still had a choice. Despite knowing that his memory and thinking were slipping, he refused consistent medical help. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE from repeated head trauma, was quietly tightening its grip, warping his judgment, distorting his emotions, and turning everyday decisions into unpredictable risks. Friends drifted away, worn down by his volatility. Family members grew exhausted. Board positions and leadership roles began to slide out of reach. Isolation settled in thick and heavy. By the late 2000s, depression had wrapped itself around him day and night. Dave Duerson could see himself sliding down, but he couldn't find a way to stop. In 2011, after years of self-destructive behavior, he made the decision that would end everything. He shot himself in the chest, deliberately avoiding his head. In his final messages, he asked that his brain be preserved for study. It was a last painful act of clarity from a man who suspected what was happening inside his skull and wanted answers for others, even as he could no longer save himself. Chris Lighty, the hip-hop power broker who ground himself down under a mountain of pressure. Chris Lighty rose from the Bronx streets to become one of the most feared and respected executives in hip-hop. As the driving force behind Violator Management, he helped steer the careers of some of the genre's biggest names. His sharp instincts, ruthless work ethic, and ability to bridge artists and corporations made him a central figure in an era when hip-hop was turning into big business. To the outside world, Chris Lighty was power, the man in control, the one everyone else needed. But around 2010, when he was just past 40, the foundation beneath that power began to shift. The industry was changing fast. Old management models were wobbling. New digital realities demanded new strategies. Deals became harder, margins thinner. The pressure on the head of Violator didn't ease, it intensified. His days stretched into endless marathons, meetings stacked on top of meetings, calls at all hours, contracts needing signatures and revisions. Sleep became optional. Night after night he pushed through exhaustion, telling himself there was no room for slowing down, not when entire careers hinged on his decisions. At the same time, his private life was unraveling. A difficult divorce process beginning in 2011 fractured whatever sense of refuge home had once given him. Arguments dragged on, creating a constant background noise of conflict. Before those could settle, another blow landed, tax debts running into the millions. The man who had climbed out of poverty to the peak of the industry suddenly found himself staring at cold, unforgiving numbers, and they didn't care about his legacy. In response, Chris Lighty doubled down on the only coping strategy he trusted: work harder. He drove himself past reasonable limits, then reached for hard liquor as a temporary off-switch when the day finally ended. Tense negotiation sessions were followed by long nights with bottles. Food became an afterthought. He would stagger through a few hours of sleep, then restart the cycle, groggy and undernourished. As things worsened, he started cutting off contact. Phones went unanswered. Texts and emails piled up. He skipped key meetings, sent no explanations, and watched long-standing relationships strain, even with artists he'd helped build like 50 Cent. The more pressure he felt, the more he retreated into silence, letting opportunity after opportunity slip away. His health deteriorated under the grind. Exhaustion and alcohol chipped away at his body. Stress and isolation chipped away at his mind. From roughly 2010 to 2012, that self-eroding routine continued day after day, pushing him deeper into a corner that felt smaller each time he woke up. In 2012, after a heated family argument, the tension finally snapped. Chris Lighty ended his life with a gunshot, leaving behind an industry in shock and a blueprint of how power without rest, pressure, without support, can quietly turn into self-destruction. Nina Simone, the protest music icon who spent decades trapped in her own storms. Nina Simone was one of the most singular artists of the 20th century. Her music defied neat categories, fusing jazz, blues, soul, classical technique, and raw political fire into something only she could deliver. On stage, she was more than a singer or pianist. She was a force. Her protest songs didn't just entertain, they accused, demanded, and shook listeners out of complacency. Nina Simone didn't live on the sidelines of history. She stood in the middle of it and shouted. But while her career burned bright, her inner life was fracturing. From the late 1960s onward, even as her influence grew, her mind began to splinter under the weight of old trauma, racism, artistic pressure, and untreated mental illness. In 1967, after a tense performance, the mask slipped in a way that terrified those around her. In a distressing episode, she reportedly dumped an entire box of brown powder over her own head, trying desperately to even her skin tone, a distorted act of self-soothing that revealed how deeply questions of appearance and identity had scarred her. Rambling speech, erratic behavior, and hallucinations followed. What the world would later recognize as bipolar disorder was at the time barely understood and rarely treated properly. 2 years later, in 1969, her marriage to Andy Stroud collapsed. The breakup came on top of a lifetime of wounds, childhood memories of being denied musical opportunities because of her skin color, constant racism, and a sense that America itself had betrayed her. The anger and disappointment hardened into a long, sharp resentment. Nina Simone began shutting doors, first emotionally, then literally. She left her daughter in Barbados, severed regular contact with family, and did not appear even when her father was dying. After his funeral, she turned increasingly to alcohol, using the numbness it offered as a shield against the chaos inside her own head. In the 1970s, her self-destructive behavior became more visible and harder to explain away as temperament. In Liberia, during what should have been an ordinary shopping trip, She suddenly stripped off her clothes and began dancing wildly, crashing into store shelves. It wasn't creative freedom. It was a mind losing its grip in public. At a show in Casablanca, feeling disrespected by the audience, she snapped. In a burst of rage, she reportedly chased some people with a knife, then turned it on herself, slashing her own leg. The performance imploded. Her reputation took more hits. Each incident left scars on her career and her personal life. Family members stepped back to protect themselves. Her daughter carried deep emotional wounds from years of instability. Promoters and collaborators grew wary. Contracts were cancelled. Tours fell apart. Nina Simone drifted through a kind of exile, moving between European countries with no true sense of home. Hotel rooms and rented apartments replaced any fixed address. Her body weakened, her spirit frayed. Over roughly a decade, she was hospitalized repeatedly, some reports say hundreds of times, for episodes tied to self-harm and mental breakdowns. Only in her later years, when doctors finally gave her a clearer diagnosis and more effective treatment, did some sense of stability return. The storms inside her never fully disappeared, but the edges softened enough for her to reclaim fragments of peace. Behind the legend, behind the fearless protest songs and electrifying performances, was a woman who spent decades punishing herself in anger, loneliness, and unresolved pain, proof that even the strongest voice on stage can be fighting a war no one in the audience can see. Don Cornelius, the Soul Train king who slowly punished himself with silence, exhaustion, and danger. Don Cornelius once stood at the very center of Black American pop culture. As the creator and host of Soul Train, he was the calm, steady presence guiding viewers through performances that would become historic. His deep voice, composed expression, and carefully curated style made him look unshakable. For decades, he brought artists, dancers, and audiences together in a show that was more than entertainment. It was a cultural milestone. But as the years passed and new generations arrived, the light around him dimmed. By the late 1990s, in his early 60s, the man who had given so many artists a platform began to face his own body's limits. In 1997, he underwent brain surgery for an aneurysm, a serious operation that left lingering effect. Not long after, the headaches returned, severe, relentless stretching for hours. Doctors prescribed medication. Don Cornelius reportedly refused to take it properly. Instead of following treatment plans, he chose to endure the pain in silence. His Los Angeles home slowly turned into a sealed-off refuge. Curtains drawn, phone calls ignored, he drifted away from the industry and social life that had once revolved around him. Personal losses hit hard. A second divorce in 2001 carved a deep emptiness into his days. The entertainment world was changing fast. New shows, new hosts, new formats. The more television moved on, the more Don Cornelius pulled back. By around 2003, he had almost completely disappeared from everyday social contact. Weeks passed with him barely leaving the house, skipping meals and letting friendships fade. Inside those walls, time seemed to loop. He reportedly watched old Soul Train tapes over and over, replaying the era when everything made sense, when every week brought new music and new energy. That nostalgia didn't comfort him. It trapped him. As Soul Train finally came to an end in 2006, the silence he'd been keeping around himself grew heavier. The show was over. The stagemaster had no stage. Depression deepened. By 2008, signs of reckless behavior appeared. He began driving alone late at night, speeding along nearly empty roads. Sometimes, according to accounts, he drove with his headlights off, testing the edge between survival and disaster. Near collisions and close calls should have been warnings. Instead, they became part of his private ritual, a way to feel something in the middle of emotional numbness. His health continued to erode under the combined weight of untreated pain, isolation, and age. Refusing consistent medical care, he pushed his body until it rebelled, leading to emergency hospitalizations for exhaustion. His relationships with his children suffered under the strain. Generational gaps, unspoken hurt, and years of emotional distance built invisible walls he could not seem to break through. From the late 2000s into the early 2010s, Don Cornelius lived in a shrinking world of memories and unhealed wounds. The man who had once orchestrated joy for millions now spent his days locked in a private loop of regret, loneliness, and physical suffering he would not properly treat. In 2012, after years of denial, withdrawal, and self-inflicted isolation, it ended with a gun in his own home. A TV icon who had helped define black music on screen left behind a final unsettling chapter, a story of what can happen when the applause stops, but the pain doesn't. Tina Turner, the soul rock queen who weaponized her own body just to keep going. Tina Turner's name once exploded through arenas like a siren. With Ike Turner and later on her own, she turned stages into battlegrounds of rhythm and fire dancing, shouting and singing with a power that seemed almost superhuman. To fans watching from the crowd, she was pure force, unstoppable, tireless, a woman built for the spotlight. But behind the curtain, especially from the late 1960s onward, her life was a cycle of fear and pain. Her marriage to Ike Turner, which had begun in the early 1960s, turned into a long, brutal pattern of physical and emotional abuse. Every show that ended in applause was followed by a return to a private world where violence could erupt at any moment. In 1968, after one particularly savage beating, Tina Turner reached a breaking point. She swallowed a large amount of sleeping pills, hoping, according to later reports, to escape the nightmare, if only briefly. She woke up in a hospital body, weak, mind blank, the cycle not truly broken. What followed was a new twisted phase. Instead of only receiving pain from outside, she began to inflict pain on herself, as if trying to prove she could survive anything. In the early 1970s, before shows, she reportedly stood in front of the mirror and scratched her own face with her fingernails, small marks, hidden under makeup, invisible under stage lights, but very real to her. It became a ritual, tension building, then released through controlled self-harm before she walked out smiling. By 1974, the strain reached another level. Rehearsals turned into marathons. Tina pushed herself through dance routines until her feet bled inside her shoes. Hour after hour, she drove her body past exhaustion, shaking with fatigue, sweat pouring, sometimes collapsing. Fainting spells didn't earn her rest. They became obstacles to conquer. In her mind, pushing past pain was proof that weakness had no place in her life. The shows remained powerful. Audiences had no idea how much blood and fear stood just behind the curtain. But the cost accumulated slowly and brutally. Her body weakened. Joints ached constantly. Chronic pain began to shadow every step. Some performances had to be cancelled. The career that seemed unstoppable started to stutter. Inside, the mental wounds cut even deeper. Years of abuse, control, and self-punishment left scars no doctor could see on a scan. By 1976, after finally reaching the limit of what she could endure, Tina Turner made a decision that would change everything. She walked away from Ike Turner, almost broke, carrying little but her name and the will to start again. That escape ended the most brutal cycle of physical self-torture tied directly to her marriage. But the psychological scars followed her for years, etched into how she saw herself, how she worked, and how she coped with pressure. The world eventually celebrated her as a survivor and a symbol of strength. Behind that symbol was a woman whose body had been a battlefield, one she sometimes turned against herself just to keep performing. Richard Pryor, the comedy legend who turned his pain into fire, then almost burned himself alive. Richard Pryor rewrote the rules of stand-up comedy. On stage and on screen, he told stories that Hollywood wasn't ready for, ripping open topics of race trauma and fear with a raw honesty that made people laugh even as they flinched. Studios, audiences, and other comics all understood this man wasn't just funny. He was dangerous in the way only truth-tellers can be. From the outside, his life looked like a wild success story. Hit movies, sold-out shows, huge influence. But by the late 1970s, in his mid-30s, the same engine that fueled his brilliance was starting to tear him apart. Fame had come fast and heavy, bringing with it a kind of emptiness he didn't know how to fill. Around 1978, cocaine stepped into the center of his life. It wasn't just a party accessory, it became a daily coping mechanism, a way to outrun childhood abuse, old wounds, and the constant fear of falling from the top. The drug blurred the line between performance and reality, between risk and outright self-destruction. He began chasing that edge in other ways too. In 1979, he reportedly took to speeding on motorcycles along Los Angeles freeways, no helmet, minimal caution, pushing the throttle harder each time. Crashes and injuries became almost routine. Near a dozen serious accidents piled up as if he were daring life to call his bluff and end the game. By 1980, under the weight of addiction and emotional chaos, the spiral deepened into something even more horrific. In a drug-fueled state, he poured gasoline on his own body and set himself on fire. Flames tore across his skin, burning over half of it. The world watched in shock as the man who made them laugh lay in a hospital bed fighting to stay alive through agony most people can't imagine. The skin eventually healed with time, surgeries, and medical care. But the internal battle didn't end there. By 1981, the physical wounds were scarred over, yet the turmoil beneath the surface continued. Richard Pryor reportedly punched walls in rage, breaking bones in his hands, ignoring doctors' warnings. Bruises, fractures, and swelling became part of a brutal recurring pattern. Film schedules were derailed. Projects were delayed or canceled. Family relationships crumbled further under the weight of volatility and addiction. His body, repeatedly pushed past the limit, became fragile. These self-inflicted injuries and years of stress are often cited as factors that contributed to his declining health and later multiple sclerosis diagnosis. Yet paradoxically, that same dark chain eventually forced him into a reckoning. After hitting bottom physically and emotionally, he entered rehabilitation and slowly crawled back toward stability. When he returned to the stage, he was changed, but the scars, visible and invisible, never left. Behind every legendary bit, behind the laughter that shook theaters and living rooms, was a man who had spent years turning his own body into a canvas for pain. Richard Pryor's story shows the razor-thin line between using your suffering as material and being consumed by it entirely. Donny Hathaway, the soul prodigy, who locked himself inside a paranoid darkness. Donny Hathaway was once spoken of in near whispers, as if saying his name too loudly might break the fragile magic in his music. His voice had a rare warmth and his phrasing carried a weight that seemed far older than his years. Duets with Roberta Flack climbed the charts and wrapped themselves around people's lives. Critics praised him as a rare soul genius and artist who could turn a simple line into a confession that felt like it belonged to everyone. From the outside, it looked like a straight ascent. More records, more sessions, more acclaim. But by the early 1970s, the light on stage and the shadows behind it started to split apart. In 1972, as his career pressed forward with constant work, Donny Hathaway made a choice that looked harmless on the surface and devastating in hindsight. He began forcing himself into long fasts. These weren't symbolic gestures or carefully managed diets. They were stretches of time where he pushed past hunger, let his body thin out, and watched his strength drop. His voice, once so effortlessly strong, began to fray. Yet he kept going, as if keeping himself physically uncomfortable would somehow keep his mind sharp enough to outrun the chaos building inside. By 1973, the word bipolar finally entered his medical records. Delusions and paranoid thoughts grew clearer. He began to feel watched, manipulated, controlled by forces he couldn't see. In an industry already heavy with pressure contracts and politics, the line between real stress and imagined surveillance blurred until everyday life felt like an ambush. In 1974, during a stay at a New York hotel, Donny Hathaway reportedly shut the door and simply stopped coming out. Phone calls went unanswered. Knocks on the door were ignored. Days slipped by while colleagues and friends tried to track him down. Important performances were missed with no explanation, leaving bandmates and organizers stunned. The truth was simple and terrifying. He was choosing isolation as a kind of punishment, walling himself off as his mind turned against him. By 1977, his self-destructive behavior became impossible to overlook. In paranoid states, he took scissors to his own hair, hacking off chunks in studios and hotel rooms, leaving piles of curls on the floor, like pieces of himself. Scratches and marks appeared on his arms. His physical health dropped fast. Hospitalizations followed psychiatric admissions that interrupted albums and delayed projects, each stay a short pause in a descent that never really reversed. The record label grew wary. Collaborators, unsure of which version of Donny they'd get on any given day, struggled to plan. The man whose music once felt like a steady hand on listeners' shoulders was now barely able to steady himself. Between the mid-1970s and 1979, the spiral deepened: more isolation, more self-harm, more breaks from reality. The world didn't see most of it. What they saw were uneven appearances, postponed sessions, and hints of something terribly wrong. In 1979, the chain of self-torture, starvation, isolation, self-inflicted wounds, and a mind tearing itself apart reached its final break. Donny Hathaway's body was found outside a 15-story building in New York. Official reports called it a fall. For the people who had watched his long collapse, it felt like the last tragic step of a journey he'd been forced down by an illness no one fully understood or managed in time. Al Green, the soul singer turned pastor who punished himself with extreme abstinence. Al Green's voice slid through radios like a warm confession. His love songs, tender, smooth, and powerful, defined a generation's idea of romance and intimacy. He was the polished face of soul-sharp suits, confident presence, and a tone that made pain sound almost beautiful. For years his name crowded the charts and his image filled stages, posters, and TV screens. But beneath that glow, his life tilted in a direction few fans expected. In 1974, a shocking incident left deep physical and emotional scars. A woman he was involved with attacked him with scalding hot grits, causing severe burns. The trauma from that event, combined with guilt over his own choices and a faith crisis, pushed him to step away from the life he had known. From the mid-1970s, Al Green turned to religion with a force that felt less like calm surrender and more like punishment. He became a pastor, but instead of adopting a balanced spiritual life, he threw himself into preaching as though every sermon had to bleed something out of him. By 1975, he was delivering sermons that stretched for hours, his voice cracking, his body trembling, but refusing to stop. It looked like devotion. Up close, it was closer to self-sacrifice. He treated his breath as a debt he owed, each word a payment for past mistakes. By 1978, the intensity escalated. Some sermons reportedly lasted up to 5 hours without him taking a sip of water. Nights became battlegrounds of prayer, long sleepless stretches, where he pushed himself to stay awake, convinced that rest would mean spiritual failure. Fatigue blurred his vision, but he insisted on going further. His body shook, but he kept pushing as if the suffering itself was the point. On scattered tours in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he added another layer of self-denial. He began cutting his food intake down to near nothing, surviving on water and dry bread for days at a time. The idea of cleansing started to merge with the idea of punishment. Weight dropped rapidly. Headaches became constant companions. At one point, dehydration hit so hard that hospitalization was unavoidable. The consequences were clear. His stamina deteriorated. Performances grew uneven. Recording projects became less frequent. The same discipline that once made him a star was now turned inward, used as a weapon against his own body and mind. Yet somewhere near the bottom of that abyss, a shift occurred. Burned out from years of pushing himself beyond human limits, Al Green began to find a more sustainable rhythm. The same pastoral path that once sparked extreme self-denial slowly transformed into a quieter, steadier life. He didn't erase the past. The burns, the guilt, the punishing sermons, and the near-starvation years all left their mark. But he stopped using faith as a whip and started allowing it to be a refuge. His stage glory faded from the front lines. In its place, he built a slower existence where old wounds were no longer reasons to torture himself daily, but scars he finally learned to live with. Phyllis Hyman, the elegant jazz voice that slowly dismantled her own support system. Phyllis Hyman's voice was the kind that made rooms go still. Deep, rich, and unhurried, it carried a kind of elegance that seemed almost out of time. She moved through jazz and soul with ease, earning critical praise and sharing stages with major names. To audiences and reviewers, she was sophistication made flesh, poise controlled, and devastatingly expressive. But while the spotlight framed her as a pillar of composure inside, she was constantly bracing against pressures that never let up. From 1980 onward, just as her career was entering pivotal territory, Phyllis Hyman began driving herself into a spiral of exhaustion. New York, the city of opportunity, became a maze. The music scene was competitive, harsh, and unforgiving, especially for a black woman trying to claim space in an industry riddled with gender and race biases. Rejection didn't just sting, it dug into old insecurities. In 1983, a marriage fell apart, leaving her with one less place to rest her mind. Instead of seeking new support, she did the opposite. After disappointing recording sessions, she reportedly cut contact with close friends. Phone lines that once rang with familiar voices went silent. Calls went unanswered. Invitations were ignored. The door, both literal and emotional, closed. Isolation became her default setting, not because no one cared, but because she couldn't bear to face them. That withdrawal lasted for years. People who had once seen her often began wondering if she was still alive. Then, in 1987, a shift on the surface seemed to occur. Phyllis stepped into nightlife again, attending long parties and staying out late. But the way she did, it revealed a different kind of self-destruction. Alcohol flowed heavily. Her words reportedly grew sharper as the nights progressed, cutting into other people and herself. Conflicts flared. Bridges that might have been rebuilt were set on fire instead. The more she clung to crowded rooms and loud music, the lonelier she seemed to become. As the early 1990s arrived, the pressure intensified. Opportunities that could have opened new paths appeared, and she turned them down. In 1991, she reportedly refused all incoming collaboration offers, not because there were none, but because shutting doors had become a form of punishment. She wasn't just being overlooked by the industry, she was actively locking herself out of it. Anxiety sharpened. Signs of mental strain grew clearer. With every project declined, every call ignored, the circle around her shrank. Relationships in the business frayed, then snapped. Invitations stopped coming. Silence, once something she chose, started choosing her. The chain of self-sabotage stretched on for years, wearing down her career and her spirit in equal measure. By 1995, the weight of it all, rejection, isolation, alcohol, emotional wounds, came to a tragic end when she died by overdose, leaving behind notes that hinted at just how long she had been fighting herself. Her life was proof that self-harm doesn't always look like a single dramatic act. Sometimes it's a series of quiet decisions, calls, not answered invitations, declined opportunities, rejected support systems, dismantled step by step, until there's no one left to hold the weight but the person already collapsing under it. Halle Berry, the cinema goddess, who quietly wore her body down with relentless overwork. Halle Berry didn't just walk into Hollywood, she fought her way into it. From modeling runways to early TV roles and then to films, she carved out space in an industry that had a long history of sidelining women of color. Awards magazine covers, red carpets, they all began to orbit her. To the public, she became a symbol of breakthrough beauty, talent, and unyielding drive, all wrapped into one. But behind the glow, the cost was building day after day. In the most unforgiving way possible, her own body. In the late 1980s, still in her 20s, Halle Berry was moving at a speed most people only imagine. Auditions, rehearsals, shoots, meetings stacked back to back until days blurred. Then came the diagnosis that should have forced everything to slow down: diabetes. Instead of easing up and learning to live with the illness, she reportedly did the opposite. The grind intensified. She stayed up through the night reading scripts, preparing for auditions, maintaining the physical standards the industry demanded. Sleep shrank down to scattered hours. Her body, already under constant strain, began to send warnings: dizziness on set, sudden waves of fatigue. Once she fainted in the middle of a shoot. To outside observers, these might have looked like isolated incidents. Inside her routine, they were just folded into the schedule. Collapsing wasn't a reason to stop. It was a brief interruption before forcing herself back into motion. The early 1990s brought even heavier pressure. Hollywood expectation hardened. Roles were scarce for black actresses. Each rejection echoed louder than the last. According to those who knew her then, she responded by turning the pressure inward. In 1991, after a string of failed auditions, she reportedly punished herself with brutal hours, long runs pounding pavement, until her back and legs screamed. Minor injuries stacked up: pulled muscles, aching joints, sharp pains that should have meant rest. She treated them as obstacles, not warnings. When her first marriage fell apart in 1993, the emotional shock didn't slow her down, it pushed her further into the grind. She filled every waking hour with work projects, overlapping travel, promotional commitments. Sleep dropped to 3 or 4 hours a night at times. She refused to let herself stop moving, using exhaustion as a way to crowd out personal pain. The results were predictable, but no less devastating. Her diabetes left to fight against stress, and overwork worsened. Hospitalizations for sheer physical depletion followed. Chronic aches set in. Energy levels dropped. Some roles slipped away simply because her body couldn't keep up with the demands anymore. Yet that brutal phase where she quietly let ambition and guilt grind her down reshaped her. After a 2-month hospital stay forced her to stop everything looked different. The collapse that nearly broke her also hardened her resolve and sharpened her perspective. She came back from that brink with a new kind of toughness, less about ignoring pain, more about navigating through it. From there, Halle Berry pushed forward into the years where Hollywood would finally be forced to recognize her at the highest level. But the price for that breakthrough was already written into her body, scars of a period when she treated herself not as a person, but as a machine that had no right to shut down. Ken Griffey Jr., the young baseball phenomenon, who kept driving himself toward the edge. Ken Griffey Jr. arrived in professional baseball like lightning. Talent seemed to run in his bloodline. His father was already a star, and the younger Griffey stepped into the game with a smooth swing and natural instincts that made scouts talk about destiny. He became the face of a new generation in the MLB, powerful at the plate, confident on the field, built to carry a franchise and a family legacy. But the glow around his rise hid the strain underneath. Expectations came early and hard. As a teenager in 1987, just 17 years old, Griffey Jr. was already living with the weight of his name and the scrutiny that came with it. Arguments at home about disciplined behavior and pressure pushed his emotions into corners he didn't know how to escape. In a moment of impulsive overload, he reportedly swallowed a dangerous amount of aspirin, an act that forced his body to the brink. He woke up in a hospital, alive but ashamed. The incident was quickly buried under training schedules and future headlines, but it marked something important. This was a teenager already testing the border between coping and self-harm. By 1989, as he entered the major leagues, the pressure mutated but didn't diminish. Now, it centered on performance. To prove he deserved his place separate from his father's name, he attacked practice with a ferocity that bordered on punishment. Batting sessions stretched far past normal. He hit until his hands tore, blood soaking into the fabric of his gloves. Coaches and staff urged him to rest, bandage up, heal. Griffey Jr. often pushed through. To him, each sting of pain felt like proof that he was working hard enough to justify the expectations piled on his shoulders. The pattern extended off the field. Around 1990 and into his early 20s, he channeled stress into high-risk thrills. Mountain biking became an outlet, but not the relaxed, scenic kind. He barreled down steep slopes at high speed, minimal protective gear, minimal caution, skidding around corners, and tempting falls. Crashes came regularly. Cuts, scrapes, bruises, near misses each one, a brief timeout before he climbed back on the bike and hurtled down again. These repeated risks brought consequences. Minor injuries forced him to miss games. Strains and soreness undermined his consistency. Mood dips crept in when he couldn't be on the field, when his body finally insisted on a pause. But through it all, he kept pushing himself toward an impossible standard to be unbreakable, both as a son living in a legend's shadow and as a player expected to become one himself. In the end, that early phase of self-eroding effort forged an extraordinary mental resilience. Once he learned how to steer that relentless energy, instead of letting it steer him, his career exploded. He set home run records, became a beloved figure in the sport, and left a mark on baseball history that had nothing to do with his last name. But the scars from those early years remained silent reminders of a kid who tried to prove his worth by grinding his body and mind past the limit long before the world realized just how good he really was. Tamar Braxton, the reality TV star caught in a spiral of self-punishment and public breakdown. Tamar Braxton didn't slip quietly into fame. She walked in loudly with a big voice and an even bigger personality. On reality TV, on talk shows, and on stage, she became known for her sharp-tongued, candid reactions and powerhouse vocals. In a family already packed with recognizable names, she carved out her own lane by refusing to dim herself down. But from around 2015 onward, even as cameras kept rolling, a different story was unfolding behind the scenes. Tamar didn't pick up razors or blades, but she did find a modern weapon to turn against herself: social media. Status updates and posts began to mirror her shifting moods. Messages appeared and disappeared, some laced with self-blame, some calling herself a failure, others hinting at exhaustion she never said out loud in person. Every time she deleted a post, the internet had already grabbed screenshots. Media outlets dissected each one. Comments flooded in. The more she tried to control her image online, the more trapped she became in what others thought of her. The spiral tightened in 2017 when her marriage fell apart in a very public way. The collapse of her home life didn't stay private. It spilled into TV episodes, interviews, and online debates. Within her own famous family, constant comparisons to her more globally known sister became another invisible weight. Publicly, they were a TV dynasty. Privately, the pressure of living in that hierarchy cut deep. Tamar turned to her followers and detractors alike for a kind of twisted validation. She dove into online arguments, clapping back at critics with words that hurt others, but also clearly hurt her. According to accounts, there were stretches where she stayed awake for days, locked into digital battles with people she'd never meet. Sleep vanished. Anger and anxiety replaced rest. By 2018, her body began to show the strain. Breakdowns hit hard. Emotional volatility spilled into everyday life. The more exhausted she became, the more volatile her reactions turned. Instead of stepping back, she kept going, using motion and conflict to drown out whatever she didn't want to face in stillness. In 2020, the pressure finally broke through the surface. Tamar pulled away from family support and ignored advice as her mood darkened. In a moment of severe instability, she reportedly took a dangerous amount of pills. Emergency intervention saved her life, but the incident ripped away any illusion that she was just being dramatic for TV. This was someone living on the edge of her own endurance, using herself as the battlefield. Recovery was not instant, but after hospitalization and therapy, she began slowly rebuilding. Work paused. Some shows were delayed. The public image that had once seemed invincible faded a little, replaced by someone more fragile, but also more aware. For perhaps the first time in years, Tamar Braxton began to confront the role she had played in her own suffering instead of using the chaos for content. Her story is a modern form of self-harm, not always visible, not always physical, but carried out through sleep deprivation, constant conflict, and the unwillingness to step away from a crowd that cheered as she unraveled. Fantasia Barrino, the powerhouse voice who punished herself through toxic love and endless overwork. Fantasia Barrino's rise from poverty to American Idol winner looked on TV like the perfect redemption arc. Her performances felt raw and honest, like every note carried a piece of the life she'd fought through. After the show, she moved into recording, touring, and even Broadway, proving she was far more than a reality TV flash in the pan. To fans, she was a symbol of survival, a single mother who had beaten the odds with sheer talent and will. But underneath that triumph, pressure built in ways she struggled to name. Early financial strain after her debut, the harsh glare of media scrutiny, and deep unresolved trauma from childhood, all wrapped around her at once. Instead of healing, she slipped into patterns that seemed designed to hurt herself from the inside out. Between roughly 2008 and 2015, she began gravitating toward relationships that chipped away at her self-worth. According to her own later accounts, she clung to partners who were controlling, unfaithful, or emotionally damaging, as if convinced she didn't deserve anything better. Tension, jealousy, and emotional cruelty became recurring features of her personal life. When family tried to intervene, arguments exploded. Fantasia internalized the blame publicly, insisting she was at fault, even when she wasn't the one causing the harm. She described herself as weak, as damaged, as someone from poor origins who somehow owed the world more suffering. That mindset set the stage for the darkest point. In 2010, after a particularly intense family confrontation and mounting public criticism, Fantasia reached a dangerous breaking point. In a dazed, depleted state, she took an overdose of aspirin and sleeping pills. She survived, but woke up with her body wrecked, and her spirit hollowed out. The incident quickly splashed across headlines as a grim warning sign. Yet even then, the chain of self-punishment didn't snap immediately. Instead, she turned to overwork as another weapon against herself. In 2013, her health was visibly declining, but she still forced herself through heavy touring and demanding performances, treating exhaustion as a kind of penance for past choices. Her voice, once her greatest strength, finally rebelled. She experienced a serious vocal setback, losing much of her range for months. Shows were cancelled. Schedules were rearranged. The thing that had lifted her out of poverty was now at risk of being damaged beyond repair. Combined with strain at home, especially in her relationship with her daughter, the pressure pushed her toward a crossroads. Eventually, the pain had nowhere left to go but the page. Fantasia began writing and speaking openly about her past, not to wrap it in glamour, but to examine the guilt, the bad decisions, and the years of quiet self-harm. The process forced her to stop simply enduring and start understanding. It didn't erase the scars, but it allowed her to step onto future stages with a different stance, not as someone who believed she deserved hurt, but as someone who knew she had survived it and was trying one decision at a time not to turn the knife on herself again. Cheslie Kryst, the perfect Miss USA, who lived under unbearable pressure behind a flawless image. Cheslie Kryst looked like a modern fairy tale. Miss USA title holder, attorney with an impressive sum, television correspondent with a polished presence and effortless charm. Her life as presented to the world seemed almost aggressively perfect, a bright smile, sharp mind, impeccable style, and a schedule that suggested she could handle anything. After winning Miss USA in 2019, she moved to New York, far from her family and the support systems that had quietly held her together. The city offered opportunity, but it also magnified pressure. Workdays stretched to 18 hours, stacked with on-camera assignments, appearances, legal responsibilities, and expectations tied to her crown. Her body began to protest. Fatigue pressed down. Sleep became shallow and incomplete. But slowing down felt impossible. Cheslie had built an image of the strong, successful woman who does it all, and she seemed determined to live up to it no matter what it cost her privately. As the pandemic reshaped the world in 2020, isolation added another layer of strain. While others showed vulnerability, she tightened her emotional guard even further. Journals, it was later revealed, carried lines of self-criticism: not good enough, not strong enough, not living up to the perfect version of herself she believed people expected to see. She rarely asked for help. Instead, she doubled down on silence. Depression dug in deeper, hidden behind curated posts and camera-ready smiles. By 2021, her coping methods had taken a worrying turn. She began seeking out solo adventures that walked a thin line between thrill and danger, hiking and climbing trips taken with minimal preparation, pushing herself onto risky terrain with little more than poles and water bottles. According to reports, she experienced multiple accidents, slips, falls, moments where a slightly different angle could have meant disaster. Yet the pattern continued. It was as though the physical risks gave her a brief illusion of control over the chaos inside. Each brush with danger offered a flash of intensity she no longer felt in daily life.